This is part 2 of solving rational equations. We are now on problem number 5. So when I look at problem number 5, step 1 is to factor, which we do not have to factor here. Step 2, or the other part of step 1, is to remember what would make our denominator 0. So what are our restrictions? So I know that x cannot be 3 and x cannot be -1. Because if x were 3 or -1, that would make the denominator 0. Next, we want to find the least common denominator. Remember, the least common denominator should be one of every factor. So my least common denominator is x minus 3 times x plus 1. Once you have that least common denominator, you're going to multiply every term in the equation by that least common denominator. So x minus 3, x plus 1 over 1 times 2 over x minus 3 equals x minus 3, I'm writing too fast. All right, then you can go and simplify one term at a time. So if I look at this first term, the x minus 3's can divide out, and I'm left with 2 times x plus 1 equals, look at this whole term, the x plus 1's divide out, and I'm left with 3 times x minus 3. Continue to do the math. Continue solving, and I get, this is a 9, and I would get x equals 11, and I am done. All right, problem number 6. 6 is interesting because if you look at these denominators, hopefully you would notice that they're actually opposites of each other. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at this denominator and I'm going to factor out a -1. When I factor out a -1, the x becomes positive and the 4 becomes negative. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this -1 and I'm going to bring it up to the numerator. So when I rewrite it, it's going to look like this. Okay, so what would be my restrictions? X cannot be 4. And my least common denominator is going to be the factor x minus 4. So I'm going to multiply everything by x minus 4 over 1. And when I do that, my x minus 4's divide out, and I get -2x. On this side, the x minus 4's divide out, and I have x squared. Now we're left with a quadratic. And when we have a quadratic, we want to get our quadratic equal to 0. So I'm going to add this 2x to both sides. Then I'm going to factor out an x. Set each factor equal to 0. And I get x equals 0 and x equals -2. And those are my answers. Moving on. Number 7. So the denominator can't be 0, so that means x cannot be -2. My least common denominator, one of every factor. So it's going to be a 2 and an x plus 2. Multiply everything by that 2 times x plus 2. Equals 2 times x plus 2 over 1 times x minus 3 over 2. All right. Once I multiply everything, then I can simplify. So here the x plus 2's divide out. And I'm left with 2 times x squared minus 3 equals. Over here, the 2's divide out. And I'm left with x plus 2 times x minus 3. Sorry about that. And now we get to the simplifying. So 2x squared minus 6. FOIL out. Again, I have a quadratic, so I want to get everything equal to 0. So subtract x squared. Right here, that is a negative x, so I'm going to add x to both sides. Add 6 to both sides. That makes that go away. So I'm left with x squared plus x equals 0. Factor out an x. Set each factor equal to 0 and solve. So x equals 0 and negative 1. Last one. Here I know that x cannot be 2 because 2 would make my denominator 0. Notice how this 3 isn't a fraction. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write it over 1 so that it is a fraction. And I know my common denominator has to be x minus 2. So I'm going to multiply everything by x minus 2. Don't forget to multiply that. Sorry. Don't forget to multiply that 3 over 1 by x minus 2. I'm running out of room. Okay, then I can go in and I can simplify. Divide the x minus 2's out, and I get 3x minus 1. Here, there's nothing to divide out, so I'm left with 3 times x minus 2. Here, the x minus 2's divide out, and I'm left with x. Now we can work out our solution. All right, I'm going to subtract this x from both sides, and I'm going to add 7 to both sides. Divide both sides by 5. X equals 7/5.